In this lesson, we're going to look at testing a simple login form component. The form has an input that the user can type their name into, and when the form is submitted, it emits a custom event so that other components in our application could potentially receive that event emission. So we're going to look at how to test that the event emission happened and it sent along with it the right payload. If event emissions are a new concept to you, I recommend you check out the Communicating Events in our Intro to Vue course, and then meet me back here. So let's get started looking at the component we'll be testing. In our components directory, you'll see we have a login form component, and it's really just a simple form with an input and a button. Our button submits the form by triggering the onSubmit method, which emits the form submitted custom event, sending along with it the payload, which in this case is our name data value, which is bound to our template with vModel. Now that we've seen the component that we'll be testing, let's create our test file. We'll create loginform.spec.js. And in here, I'm going to just paste some code to scaffold out our component. Above, we're importing our login form along with mount from Vue test utils. Then we're creating our describe block for the component. And our first test says it emits an event with a user data payload. In previous lessons, you saw me using the test method. We can also use it. They work the same way. Then we're creating a wrapper, which we're using to mount our login form component. So now we can get to implementing these 5 steps. When writing a unit test, it's helpful if we imagine how the actual end user is going to interact with our component, and then we can design the tests to replicate that behavior. So in this case, our user is going to find the input element. They're going to set the value of that input. Then they'll submit the form, which should emit that custom event containing the payload, which is the user's name. So these are the steps we'll take to design our test. First up, we need to find our text input. So we'll create a const input and use our wrapper to find that input. So in this case, we can find our input with type of text. And now that we've found it, we can set the value of it. So we'll use that const we just created and say input.setValue and pass in a string for that value. It's worth pausing here to discuss best practices around finding DOM elements. So in this case, we only have one text input, so we were able to find it this way. So for our needs, this works. But imagine if we had multiple text inputs. You might think the solution would be to then find that input based on its ID or class name, but what if somewhere down the line our designer were to change that class name or ID? So there's a better, more future-proofed way to find elements. That solution would look something like this. In the actual components template, we can use this data test attribute like so to give our element a test-specific ID. Now in order to find that, we would switch this out to find that element based on that specific data test ID attribute. Setting things up this way helps us decouple the test from the implementation details of that component. Now we don't need to worry about refactoring our test just because a designer changed some class names around. Now to keep this lesson moving, I'm not going to refactor my component to reflect this, but know that it is a recommended practice for production level tests. Once our input is found and the value is set, we then need to simulate a form submission. To do that, we'll write wrapper.trigger and pass in the event that we want to trigger, in this case, submit. In the previous lesson, we triggered a click event on the button, and since this component has a button, you might think we should trigger a click event on that to submit the form. But we just spoke about decoupling the test from the implementation details of the component. In the future, our component might not even have a button. We might be instead relying on a key-up event, for example, to submit the form. So writing it this way, where we're triggering a submit event, allows us to decouple that test from the component's details. Again, future-proofing our test. Now that we've triggered a submit on the form, our custom event should have been emitted. So let's test that that did indeed happen. To do that, we'll create a const called formSubmittedCalls. And here, we'll use the Vue test utils emitted API. We'll pass in the name of the custom event that we're checking for, and this should return an array that includes our formSubmittedEvent call. Now we can expect that formSubmittedCalls array to have length of 1. In other words, we're just checking that the formSubmittedEvent was actually emitted. Now if we scroll down here and pop open our console, we can run this test to make sure that it passes. Great, and it does. So we can move to the second and final assertion where we verify that the correct payload was sent when that form submitted event happened. So we'll create another const. In this case, it's going to store the expected payload, which is going to be an object, name, atom jar. Now inside the expect assertion, we'll copy and paste this code. If we were to console log the result of this, we would see the following. So in order to target the actual payload, that syntax would look like this, bracket 0, bracket 0. Now we can use a matcher to compare the payload that was emitted against the payload that is expected. So we'll say we expect it to match the object contained in our expected payload const. Now this should be passing as well, but let's test it out in the console. And great, we see that both our tests are now passing. We've now learned how to test a component that emits an event and verify that it contains the correct payload. And along the way, we learned some best practices around decoupling our tests from our component's implementation details. I'll see you in the next lesson. In this lesson, we're going to look at testing a simple login form component. The form will have an input that Tucker. Sorry, you got in the frame and distracted me. You sleep and lay down all day, every day. Can you do that here? Yeah, go to sleep.